Together, we work as one for better LGBTIQ lives. Outright.
Everyone, hope everyone is doing well. I am Smriti and I'm joining all of you from Delhi, India. I work with an organization called KRIA, and KRIA is a feminist international human rights organization based in the Global South and led by women from the Global South. KRIA's work draws upon the inherent value of rights-based approach to sexuality and gender equality. I hereby welcome everyone to another interesting session of the Out Summit 2022. This session talks to an important aspect of movement spaces and that aspect that leads the spaces. Yes, I'm talking about feminist leadership. Feminist leadership is not just about playing leadership roles, but also it's about building capacities to lead differently with values and ideologies that are feminist and implement them in movements, especially the LGBTQI movement. We have with us three speakers today who will talk, and all three of them come with varied experiences. I'll request the speakers if you could introduce yourselves. Tonya, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much. And just to begin with a word of gratitude to the organizers. I know that a lot of hard work went into this summit, and I really appreciate the invitation to be part of it and to share with you. And I was happy to be able to participate in some of these sessions earlier. My name is Dr. Tanya Haynes. I'm a lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barra Unit at the University of the West Indies Cayfield campus in Barbados. And a significant part of my research looks at Caribbean feminisms. So I'm very happy to share and learn around this question of feminist leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Tonya. Mariam?
Hello, everyone. Really huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for this space. My name is Mariam Gakoshashvili. I'm a director of programs for International Fund, part of Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice. I've been part of feminist grant-making institutions since 2007, so around 15 years now. I'm from Tbilisi, Georgia, but I'm based in the United States for the last 10 years almost.
Thanks, Mariam. Nano?
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. I'm Gachatan or Nanu, they, he, Director of Programs at ILGA World. ILGA is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association. It's a global federation made up of 1,800 plus organizations around from 160 plus countries and territories around the world. At ILGA World, as the Director of Programs, I look after 4 teams, one on UN advocacy, one on research, one on gender identity and gender expression and sex characteristics, and a 4th team on projects. Prior to joining ILGA World, I was at the International Labour Organization, where I was working on fundamental principles and rights at work, specifically on the principle of non-discrimination. Can I just say, as someone who's very masculine presenting, it's an honor to be in this space, and I recognize my privilege to be in this space. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today.
Thanks, Nano. Thank you so much. So let's little bit start with a very basic question. When we are talking about feminist leadership, let's break down into what feminist leadership means to each one of you. Mariam, why don't we start with you? What does feminist leadership mean to you?
Thank you, Smriti. And apologies if I need to turn off my camera. I was sneezing a little bit. But I'll try to start thinking about, first of all, it's important for me to understand in my 15 plus years of activism and working in feminist organizations that I believe in inherent leadership capacity of all people, and regardless of what are the former roles or place in organizational hierarchy or structure. I think that is a lot more than a formal thing. And also when I think about feminist leadership specifically, I need to really understand what I mean when I say feminism, because like leadership, feminism also comes in so many different forms. And over time, I learned to like name what is it that I mean by this, by the kind of feminism I want to practice and model in my leadership. And that is a queer and intersectional feminist, and feminism that's guided by Black liberation and trans feminism, feminism that is rooted in movements from global South and East and in anti-imperialism. And my feminism is super pro-sex work, pro-abortion, pro-Palestine. So what I'm trying to say is that for me, feminism, the queer intersectional feminism, is a broader anti-oppression and liberation agenda that goes beyond liberation of cis straight women from global north and the full-bodied and all that. But we need to also go beyond rhetoric and virtue signaling. For me, it is important what I do as feminist more than what I say or what are the values that I kind of express. How do I practice it, and how do I practice it in relationship to power? I'm the director of a team. I'm kind of part of a management of an organization, of a funding institution. So I have to work with power every day. And for a lot of us feminists, that is a tricky thing, and it comes with a lot of discomfort. For me, leadership and feminist leadership means getting intimate with power, learning how to wield it, learning how to be careful with it, how to do no harm, and how to share power. I think that is super important, how to share power and how to center trust, collective care, and interdependency. Always value people over the product, always value collective over individual, individualistic or individualism, especially living in the US. And also how to share leadership and understanding that we're part of a whole and we're interdependent, and how to share spotlight, how to share opportunities, how to share opportunities for growth. And then how to be really more kind of process-oriented than goal-oriented. It's really a big lesson in humility and undoing, a lot of unlearning and undoing as an everyday practice.
Thanks, Mariam. That was really interesting, like balancing both the very stereotypical power and also inheriting the feminist values in the leadership, and also like centering, sharing, and well-being is something that makes feminist leaders different from the mainstream leaders that we talk about in the capitalist world. Thanks, Mariam. Nanu, if you could share, what does feminist leadership mean to you?
Thank you. Wow. Yeah. In terms of, I mean, for someone who's masculine presenting, I think there's numerous ways feminist or feminists leaderships, sort of what they mean to me. I think it comes at three different levels. One is, and that the core of feminism for me is self-reflection and critical self-reflection. And that begins with the personal. And then it goes to your organizational, that could be within your family structures, that can be within your work structures, that could be in other structures or community spaces you hold. And then it goes to a bigger structure than, you know, how it manifests at the national level or in bigger spaces beyond that. And I think it really starts at the personal level. For me, you know, I grew up, you know, just a bit of background. I grew up in the UK, but come from a first generation family where very masculine and working class values and very masculine behaviors were taught. And there's me who did not fit in in all of this. In terms of, yes, I was working class, but when it came to masculinity, I was always at odds with it. So much so when growing up, I was always told that I should have been the girl in the family, as if being, to say that in such diasporic narratives were reinforcing the idea that being a girl was therefore being wrong, and therefore you are inherently wrong. And consequently for me, as I grew up and sort of coming through my journey of self-reflection, feminism became a critical part of that. And I didn't actually realize what I was doing, but unpicking myself and learning all those toxic behaviors that I had sort of piled onto myself to fit into societal norms that I had to be a certain way. So as a consequence, after I came out, I then sort of the journey didn't stop for me, and it started to come into activist spaces and feminist spaces where it meant, oh, actually, hang on, there's more to me than just this identity of sexual orientation, of just being working class. There's more to continuously unpick, which then consequently brought me back to my own faith and how I identify as a Sikh person, because as being of faith in a queer spaces, it's quite difficult, because you're often taught, well, can you be queer and can you be of faith? You have to refute the two. And that allowed me to better understand how my identities were created, that there's this sort of principle that you are constantly learning and unpicking yourself. And I think that's a key feminist value that I think we always must have, to be constantly self-reflective or reflective of your behaviors as well. And that consequently showed up, especially in my work, when I was president of UN Globe, which is the group that represents LGBTIQ plus people within the UN system. There, we were often criticized for having a structure that was very masculine heavy. And then how did I, as president, make sure that I was creating spaces to ensure that women and gender diverse persons and trans persons were part of that executive committee, and I was creating those spaces and identifying those barriers for that to happen. So that happens in the societal level, and then consequently how we do that at the national level in sort of government policies, in UN spaces, in other multilateral institutions as well. So I think at the crux of it, it starts with the individual. It starts with this whole narrative of learning to unpick yourself and learning to have that self-awareness. So that's what feminism means to me, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Nano. Very clearly pointed out, and very clearly you laid the path of how the personal is political. Thanks so much. Tanya, what do you think? Like, what according to you, for you, what does feminist leadership mean?
Thank you so much. And, thanks to my co-panelists for their interventions, and thank you for the question. For me, I always start with thinking about feminisms in their multiple articulations across history and in different spaces. And for me, it is important to recognize that you have feminisms that have been and continue to be trans exclusionary, or that are complicit with violence against intersex people, with intersex erasure, racist, and also very ableist, particularly in the ways that many feminist organizations work. It's almost as though a particular kind of ableism and overwork is a very central value. And so for me, beginning and understanding the fact that feminisms, which I experience as a politics with a lot of liberatory potential, but I also at the same time, I'm always cognizant of the histories and the current contemporary situation where where feminisms can and are complicit in a range of different kinds of harms. And for me, I think not expecting a pristine politics and not expecting that just saying that you are feminist or invoking intersectionality, that the work is actually, this is not how you undo these systems of oppression. This is not how you meet the ways that imperialism shows up in feminism, or that we think about in many ways, some strands of feminism have actually been quite powerful, have gained a kind of access and legitimacy and power within a range of different institutions, whether they be non-governmental or global governance institutions, that there is a way that feminist politics can manifest that is not necessarily a counter politics, right? But that is very much comfortable inhabiting and enjoying and exercising power in a very normative way. And so for me, being aware of those histories, I think about somebody like Guyanese anti-racist and feminist activist Andaye, whose entire praxis was one of a self-critique that was always also community critique. And she never shied away from calling herself out and by implication calling out everybody else. So there was never a sense that there was a righteousness from which one could proceed, or that there was a politics that wasn't always already tainted, which meant that the work was ongoing and not something that you do once and for all. And so the way that she would talk about Caribbean feminisms and some of the shortcomings, including shortcomings around working across race or working across class, or saying, you know, based on my experience of organizing with women with different levels of power need to organize autonomously and then come together. And for me, I think this is something for me that's a very important lesson, that in your work that you do, that feminist leadership has to be something that is a multiplier, not something that produces individual superstars, but that is transformative in the sense that it is exponentially replicating itself, that you have leaders across multiple different spaces who may need to organize separately from you and then come together with you. Right? And so therefore it means that regardless of who you are, there are some spaces that are actually not yours, right? That they're not yours and they're not for you, and that you have to recognize that there are these power differentials that are quite sticky between the North and the South, you know, within queer organizing, within women's organizing, that there are all of these differences of power, and respecting the need for that autonomous organizing before we can then come together. And that is one of those ways about undoing power. So for me, a feminist leadership is always one that that starts with the call out of self and how you yourself are organizing, how you yourself are recognizing the histories that you become a part of, that walk into the room with you, and including the ways that feminism has been and continues to be, like any other politics, right, compromised and implicated in these larger systems of domination, that if you are not actively working to undo them, you are actually complicit in reinforcing them. So for me, feminist leadership in a genuine sense, you know, is one that avoids any sense of it being sort of a pure or pristine politics, or a kind of a self-righteous platform, but is actually seeking to be transformative in the sense that you are working both at undoing structures and also at you know, at the same time that you are also working on how you are individually at a personal and interpersonal level, and in the organizations that you shape and run and are a part of, how are you also undoing all of these isms that, you know, we know so well. So I'm gonna end there and just say, for me, I think about Andaye and the fact that whenever Andaye gave a criticism, right, she would say, like, I'm talking about me, I'm implicated in this thing that I'm talking about too.
Thanks, Tonya. This is really something to reflect upon of like what you have said. But like having also talked about Caribbean feminism a little bit in your introduction to feminist leadership, I would take this opportunity to ask you the next question. Like being a researcher, especially on Caribbean feminism, what do you think? Is there the regional specificity which is reflecting in feminist leadership as a whole? What does your experience say?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. For me, I find it intriguing to research organizations and movements. And from the Caribbean, I think for the region, there is a specificity, but there's also the fact that the Caribbean region is this what Lisa Lowe calls the intimacy of four continents. So you do have that confluence that is very much rooted in colonization and empire and slavery and indenture and in indigenous violence and erasure of indigenous peoples in the region, of that confluence of the Americas, of Western Europe, of Asia, of Africa in that one space. So for me, it is at once specific, but it is also really a story that is global in the sense that we talk about the global. But what intrigues me about researching movements and organizing from the Caribbean in the contemporary sense, but also historically, is being able to understand the moments at which there is a radical potential, there is a rupture, there is a liberatory possibility, and how activists and thinkers and artists, and movement builders are able to take advantage of those moments, but also the moments in which they retreat from them, right? They retreat from some of these much more productive possibilities, and they decide whose rights are important in a particular moment, or thinking about how feminist organizing may actually have been complicit in criminalization of sexuality, right? In some of the laws that we have that are colonial era, but also the way that when Caribbean states reimagine for themselves what constitutes things like gender-based violence, how those particular moments also became moments of criminalization of sexuality. And so having that understanding of the feminist complicity therein. And so for me, it's I think this research that I do on Caribbean feminisms, for me, it has always been very useful for thinking both at the same time about the liberatory potential that is offered, but also understanding the moments when either as a group or individual activists or organizations make a strategic decision around wanting to preserve other kinds of things, like maybe respectability, or to prioritize the rights of one group over another, or to say, well, wait your turn, or to make certain kinds of political choices that are exclusionary, and to probe why, right? To probe the why of these kinds of decisions, to probe why they might be moments of retreating from a vision that is a lot more emancipatory and liberatory, and instead opting to settle for a certain kinds of gains that are very contingent and temporary, and understanding why that might be. And I think reading those moments and resisting the tendency to want to just be celebratory, but also to be somebody who can hold a complex and dynamic picture, I think has a lot of lessons for us in thinking about and understanding feminist leadership and some of the difficulties and the messiness of it, and the gap sometimes between the values that we want to hold and what we actually do in practice.
Right. Very well put, Tonya. This brings me to also my next question to you, Nanu. While Tonya was speaking about how some of the decisions are taken at certain point of time, certain things are prioritized at certain points of time, even through the principles of feminist leadership. So for you, what does it mean, to be, you did talk about how, as a masculine looking person, how you perceive feminist leadership. What was it for you? How the journey has been for you in becoming a feminist leader in the movement space. But like currently, what does it mean to be presenting and implementing the feminist leadership for you? Because you are already a leader in a space, in a movement space. So presenting as a masculine, there must be a lot of perceptions and expectations associated with it. So that, and how do you navigate in a leadership role currently?
That's a very good question, and I think it requires. I think that Tanya, the way you've articulated it, my own personal journey, the constant unpicking yourself, this sort of deconstructing yourself to reconstruct yourself is, and I think that's the principle of feminism. You know, this constant unlearning to learn, and I think it resonates with me so much. And I think that's the most important part of this question as well, or my response is that, you know, you have to be mindful that you're not going to get it right, and you may not be the right person in the right place. And consequently, but because of the way you look and the way you present, you are automatically afforded certain privileges. Someone has masculine spaces, and I can enter into certain spaces, and there's certain spaces I cannot enter in, quite rightly, and they're not for me. Okay, and I must acknowledge that. But there are spaces where I can access, where others cannot. But then it's my responsibility to then go in and say, well, shouldn't we bring in this voice and this voice and this voice? And I think that's really important, and how we do that as well. One, not just making sure that the voice is there and the person is there, because we can't enter into this, and I forget the terminology, this sort of ventriloquism activism. You know, imagine if you were this and this and this and this person, or this, we always imagine, imagine you're a woman of color from the global south with disability, living in poverty. And we often speak, we have this sort of virtual signaling, and we go into this sort of ventriloquism. The job is then for me to make sure we go in with those voices and make space for those voices, and ensure those voices are there, and there's a divergence of those voices. And that's not easily done, because that's not just, it's easy to do that in terms of on an ad hoc occasion, but we know that institutionally some of those barriers are structurally ingrained. And how do we do that? How do we even sort of start to break that down? And one example that we did in UN Globe, even within our movement to advocate for rights, to make sure that that there was a divergence of voices in that space, was, for example, most of the coordinators were masculine, or male presenting. So how do we then make sure that in queer spaces or LGBTIQ plus spaces, which we know are often, especially in global places, white middle class men, how do we make sure that in those spaces we have gender diverse voices, women speaking as well? So one of the key barriers that we identified was making sure that it wasn't just men running, and we were giving the opportunity, or creating a policy that said, actually, you can run as pairs or run as coordinators, but you can't be of the same gender, and one of you cannot be from this geographic region. So actually trying to dismantle or put into place policies that will sort of encourage space and create space as well, and enforce that as well, because otherwise you're going to keep on having the same people coming forward to do that. And then also making sure that our institutions were recognizing that if we are creating spaces for women to come into that this work is acknowledged and a part of, it's not just voluntary giving. I mean, yes, we know that most of our activism is voluntary, but it's acknowledged by the system. And that campaign still goes on for the UN to make sure that UN Globe volunteers are actually acknowledged. And it's not just a fact that, it's volunteerism, but it makes sure that other people can actually enter the space too. And I think part of this is realizing part of that is also doing your own homework as well. Coming to the table, coming into conversations and having done that work, and ready to be as Tonya said, was being ready to be called out, admit that you're wrong. And I think that's, and I think the biggest thing about you know, our as we as adults, or as we grow, you know, live, or you know, we're always told that being wrong is, you know, you can't be wrong, you always have to be right, and it defeats the purpose of learning. And that's something that I will go into my next a bit later on. But I think the key thing there is then, and sort of internalizing that as well, realizing that you have access to that set, the way that you're being perceived is can be challenging too. I can come into spaces and I can be seen as, well, here's another man talking, and I need to know that I need to shut up. And at that point,
C'est quelqu'un qui parle, il me faut me taire.
and at that point, I will shut up.
Sorry, just to let you know, Beatrice, yeah. Nanu, please continue.
That was it. I shut up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Nano. Okay, very rightly pointed out, Nano, what you said and what was already earlier said in the room about feminist leadership, that how it is necessary, Mariam, you pointed out, that it is also important to create that leadership capacity, inherent leadership capacity in everyone, so that there are leaders at every stage and they autonomously build their leadership, and then everyone comes and collectivize. So while we need leaders at every stage, and as Nano pointed out, not everyone can be doing everything. Not everyone has to be there in all the space. And one space is the feminist funding space. And you being there in that space, how do you navigate across the feminist funding space as a queer feminist leader? And what do you think are the strategies that the funding space also needs to adopt, so that, you know, the funds are directed at the intersectional feminist movement spaces, so that the values of feminist leadership are actually practiced in the most intersectional way?
Yeah, thank you, Smriti. Yeah, funding spaces are complicated and they are very political spaces. And I've been navigating that space since 2007. And as you know, as a queer femme, as a woman, as an immigrant in the last 10 years, I've just gotten familiar and like used to being in uncomfortable spaces, you know, navigating the cis-het feminist spaces, or navigating cis men-dominated LGBTQI spaces, and then philanthropy, and the traditional philanthropy that's super white, super Western, male, and has its roots in capitalism and anti-Blackness. And it's a very complicated space. And as someone who has always been in my kind of formal professional work, aside of the grassroots queer feminist activism, I've been always part of a feminist grant-making institution, so not a private foundation. So, and I know that this is a place of privilege and comfort, because there is less of a cognitive dissonance that I'm like kind of selling my soul to the devil, you know. But let me explain what the feminist funds are. I think we are kind of like a love child of feminist movement and traditional philanthropy. And as like every child, we have complicated relationship with our parents and families, and maybe sometimes want to, you know, kind of ignore one and just emphasize the other. And it's not, we're not doing justice to our reality when we do that. Yes, we are at the crossroads of both, and we play this kind of resource, money, activism role in philanthropy and the connecting. Like sometimes we call ourselves alchemists. We transform, or like we take the money that's like really dirty and problematic and try to do some alchemy with it so it can be transformed into something beautiful and be put in the hands of the movements and the activists who are at the front lines of all the justice efforts. So we are kind of thinking that our role is to help shift power and redistribute wealth. But we also need to do like a reality check. It is not always true. You know, we are complicit in so many ways into upholding that system. I love that we have the feminist funding model and feminist funding principles. However, we are navigating the world of compliance of the nonprofit, industrial complex, U.S. legislation, imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy. All of that is just real, and it just shows up in a daily basis. And a lot of times, it is a struggle. I think we need to start the work of transformation internally, and then just try to spread it in our kind of cousins family, which is the traditional philanthropy, which holds so much power. Of course, in our best days, we hope that we are influencing philanthropy and making it be better, shifting power. But the reality is that it's a trial and error. We fail a lot of times, and it's a constant learning and doing and undoing. I think it is very important for me that as funders and as a queer feminist person in a funding field, that I focus not only on the external, which is the vision, the strategy, the priorities, but also the internal, which is the boring hiring, like practices, HR, policies, administration, the budget. Those things are so political, and maybe they're not as sexy, but that's where the transformation starts for me. So like centering people, voices who are at the margins in those internal things when we talk about organizational culture, policies and practices, and also centering care. I really want to link care to leadership, because I think in our traditional mainstream patriarchal mindset and capitalist, white supremacist, all that, leadership is very much about this individual superstar, and care is not so much centered as an important aspect of leadership. But for me, care is so deeply integral and central to feminist and queer leadership. The understanding that we're part of one whole and that we're a part of an ecosystem, as movements and as activists and as funders. I think movements and the activists are at the front lines of some of the work of taking care of the world, taking care of the community, of the land. And as funders, we are also part of that ecosystem, and we need to take care of the movements, to take care of the caregivers, but not as a linear kind of vertical hierarchical model of supporting those who support others, but actually as a cycle, as a cyclical reciprocal model, because those movements and those activists at the front lines of the movement, they are taking care of us. They're taking care of me. So how do we return this, and how do we do this so that we're part of the same ecosystem? So for me, we also need to decolonize leadership and how we think about leadership and center care in our both internal and external and work as funders.
Thanks so much, Maria. I know it's very complicated in navigating through this feminist funding spaces, but one thing that you also talked about is the idea is to really transform, and the idea of funding spaces is also to be transformative. And having said that, you also give so much importance to care and how inherent it is for feminist leadership practices. But I wanted to ask you another question. How do you map if this feminist funding has actually transformed certain spaces? Like, how do you do a monitoring evaluation? aspect of the spaces, especially the LGBTIQ spaces, if there is a funding which has gone to this space? And do you think it is necessary to also evaluate these spaces?
I was actually recently on a Prospera meeting, which is the international network of women's funds, and one of the speakers at the panel said, let's burn down the monitoring and evaluation framework and system. And I do agree with the sentiment, but it coming from a private funder that does not actually do that internally. It is like, let's take it with a grain of salt. I think, again, transformation is to start from our organizations. And a lot of the monitoring and evaluation frameworks have not been there to serve the movements and have not been there to really, how to say, kind of measure or grasp the complex social change and transformation that we are envisioning and trying to achieve. They are really not designed to do that. But also evaluating and measuring movements, it is very complicated because movements are fluid, complex, untangible phenomena. They're not entities and tangible things to grasp and measure and scrutinize. However, I think there is a promise of evaluation when it's done right and when it's designed by the movements, because it can help us learn and reflect, course correct. And I think funders want to do that. They need to listen to movements and first of all, remove the administrative burden that it takes oftentimes and distracts activists from doing the actual work. And just, yeah, make it as easier lived as possible, and also know that it will take years, if not decades and centuries, to actually see the change. So how do we change our learning and evaluation frameworks and approaches to do that, and how we remove monitoring from it? And I'm saying that as Astrea, who is now in the process of reassessing how we do that. And in the past, I don't think we did that very well at all. So it is a question for us too. And I think there, yeah, and also self-determination, I want to mention once, like, and it goes hand in hand in trust-based grant making. If people say they are and they do, we have to trust, and there is no, yeah, it is really, we should be guided by trust and let folks define themselves. If they self-identify as feminist, as queer, that's all we need to know. And trusting the movements that they know what they're doing is super important. That's the North Star.
Absolutely, Mariam. And I so agree with you that it is high time that we, talk about word monitoring. Are we really doing a surveillance, or are we really, self-evaluating the movement space, or self-evaluating ourselves, our values, and how it has transformed certain things? Having said that, Nano, self-reflection is also a kind of, say, evaluation, or say a kind of learning that even you use in your leadership, in your feminist leadership. And just now we were talking about how there are diverse identities and diverse identities at different structures, at different spaces. And if we look at the broader feminist leadership umbrella, is it possible that while implementing certain inherent principles of feminist leadership, uh, everything will work for everyone? Because there are certain things that cannot be 100% correct for all the diverse identities that we work in the LGBTQI space. For example, if certain principles work for a trans person, it might not work for a woman with disability. So when do you think we should, really stop and reflect and think about?
Um, the funny thing about if we get rid of monitoring and evaluation, the principle of monitoring, even in itself, is self-reflection. You're constantly looking at this, evaluating is stopping at certain points, monitoring is constantly looking at what's going on. And that, if you look at the flip side, not the flip side, but the synonym of that is self-reflection, and if you have to do that constantly. So I think the key part of this question is that knowing that we're never going to get it, we're not going to get it perfect, because we are inherently we've got this false fallacy that we have told that this is it. We have stopped evolving. We are no longer growing. We are no longer changing. And that is rooted in patriarchy, it's rooted in heteronormativity, whatever you want to call it. It's rooted in this is it, you are this, and that's it. You've been put into that box from day one. And so if we go into that room and we know that we've got someone missing, because as a society we have to realize we are constantly changing, so we are going to get it wrong. Okay, and if we start from that premise, we're going to get it wrong, but then how do we rectify it? How do we correct it? And how do we create systems that allow us to rectify it as well? How do we therefore become agile, that we don't become lumbered in bureaucracy and procedure? So
I know I'll have to stop you here because
okay.
yes, because we are running short of time, and we have another important question to ask Tonya as well. Tonya, having worked with the government, having worked in the academia, and having worked with the civil society, how do you think that evaluation and learning, especially of the application of feminist leadership, is navigating through these collaborative spaces?
Thanks for that question. And I'm going to try to be really quick because I know we don't have a lot of time. I think for me, one of the working with the university, we've been working for several years with the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, which is a regional LGBTQ plus organization, and also the Barbados Council for the Disabled on a project called the Liberty Project that has been ongoing since 2018. And I think just that working together, these three organizations, we have been, we have transformed, we have been internally transformed, all three of us, but I could also see how it made a difference, the kind of work that we were doing and the attempt to work across different kinds of movements and organizations. I could see how even in the space nationally, a lot of things get done differently just because people have learned from the model that we worked so hard to try to build and have been constantly working on. And so I'm glad that you posed that question for me about learning, because I think the best leadership is one that starts from a place of learning and from recognizing that you learn from everybody, comes with knowledge, that you can learn a lot and to share from. And so part of the model that we had working with these organizations were what we call groundings, which is where we sit in, and this comes from Walter Rodney and his own decolonization work in Guyana, but where we literally just sit with and learn from each other. We're not hiring in external facilitators, but we are meeting together with somebody who is going to share something that they have learned from their own organizing with the larger group. So I will just end by saying that leadership is learning. Learning has to be at the heart of it.
Thanks so much, Tonya. We are going to close in a minute, so I'll take this opportunity to thank three of you, Tonya, Mariam, and Nanu. It has been a pleasure working with you. Thanks to Laura, and thanks to Outright and OutSummit for having us, and thanks to all the interpreters and all the attendees who joined us. Thank you so much.